I've never been the sort accused of living on the edge, but at the quarry I just reared back and jumped right off the ledge. My granddad used to say...
Hey everyone, it's Rob with 4 Songs, coming at you with another episode. Finally, can you believe it? Some consistency in this podcast. Who'd have thunk it? And here's the best news. I've got more on the way. So what you can do to make sure you don't miss anything is subscribe on Twitter. Subscribe however you listen to this podcast. Find me at 4Songs2. That's at 4Songs number 2. Share, like, favorite, whatever it is you do on social media these days. Make sure your friends know about this too, so you can support the bands that come on this show. So, you think you've been productive during COVID? I mean, maybe you started a new job, maybe you've got a new podcast, or, hey, wait a minute, that sounds like me. Anyway, we know this is not about me, so if you think you've accomplished a lot over the last 3 years, get ready to listen to my next guest, renowned folk singer John McCutcheon. For you see, John has not written just one album, not just 2, but 3 since March 2020. And as you'll hear in this interview, he's just getting started. Now, John is not new to writing music. In fact, he's been at it since the late 60s. He was inspired after watching the 1963 March on Washington, watching it on TV with his mom, and listened to the folk music. It was folk music that brought that group together. It was Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, or others. And it was married with a social movement that is critical to what makes folk music what it is. It's participation music. It's people singing back and forth to each other. And John was hooked from the start. And from there, John quickly grew to love folk music, and as a young adult, moved to Appalachia to learn more about music, folk music in particular, and the instruments from the people from the mountains. During that time, John made connections with legendary folk singers like John Paxton, whom he still writes with to this day. John's newest album, Leap, was released in September 2022. His third in 3 years, and his 43rd of his career. I mean, good Lord, I don't think I've done 43 of anything in my career. We talk about 4 songs from Leap, The Ride, The Troubles, Sorryland, and Work. We spoke from his home in Georgia as John was basking in the success of his Atlanta Braves. Prior to the interview, we talked about baseball, a subject, quite frankly, that I think either one of us could have spent a whole hour or more talking about. And I got to tell him, as his Braves close in on another deep playoff run, I'd like to remind him that it was the 2019 Washington Nationals that showed the world how to beat the cheating Houston Asterisks in the playoffs. But I'm not bitter. Nah, not anymore. Anyway, most importantly, we talked about Leap, his songwriting influences, and how he hopes to stay useful as a folk singer, where his songs now are probably more relevant than they ever were before. So please welcome John McCutcheon to 4 Songs. John, welcome to 4 Songs. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm okay. Thank you for being here. And I know you've been quite productive since all this pandemic started in March 2020. That's when I started doing this show. And we're here to talk about your new album, Leap, which is coming out in September. And it feels like we're at that point in the pandemic now where new albums are coming out that were written and recorded. But this is your 3rd album, correct? Since then?
Yeah. Well, when I was relieved of the regular trips to the airport and going off and playing hither and yon, I just thought, well, how am I going to spend my time? And I thought, well, maybe I'll just sit down and write every day. And it came fast and it came easy, and I was excited by what was showing up on my legal pad every morning, and I just kept doing it because it's, what I do.
Yeah. I mean, so it doesn't sound like it took you that long then to just kind of settle into that reality.
It didn't at all, because I had been overseas. I was in Australia when this all started, and I got home. And because I've been overseas and then on that little tubular petri dish that an airliner is for about 24 hours, my 91-year-old mother-in-law lives with us, and my wife's diabetic, and I just thought, well, nah, I got to get out of here for a while. And I didn't have chores, wasn't going to the store, wasn't going to the gym, all the things that occupied my day. And once you get in the groove, I had to stop. A lot of the songs on Leap were written a year earlier, because all of a sudden I had 150 songs, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this?
Because one of the things when I started doing this, and it was early on in the pandemic, talking to some singer-songwriters who were saying, it was actually really hard for them at first to adjust to this new normal, because they're not on the road. They're not people watching, I guess, for lack of a better term, and experiencing that part of life. And so I'm wondering, was there something about having that time that just led to this burst of creativity for you?
I learned how to let go,
Hmm.
I guess, was a lot of it. And started to think, well, maybe this is really what my job is. I mean, I'm 70 years old now, but hell, I'm right with Tom Paxton, who's 85, who is like a beacon out there for anybody who thinks, when do the juices dry up? Well, they don't have to dry up. I mean, you're not a glass, you're a well.
Well, so we'll get to Leap in a few minutes, and that comes out in September. But first, as I've mentioned at the outset, this is a podcast about songs and songwriting, and I've tried and failed miserably to write a song. So I'm always in awe of people like you who do it so well and for so long and consistently. And this may sound like a stupid question, but when did you realize that songwriting was what you wanted to do? I know reading through your biography, and you've been doing this quite at an early age, but was there a point in time when it just like lightning struck and like, okay, this is what I want to do and I'm good at it?
Oh, I know when I decided I wanted to do it. I don't know that I've gotten to the point where I'm saying I'm really good at it. I'm getting good at it, I think. I think the stuff that happened during the pandemic and just before it, when I realized, okay, two important things for me are what's the story and who is the voice. And once I can answer those two questions and then occupy that voice, then it gives me the opportunity to flesh out something in an entirely different way. I mean, I started writing songs as soon as I got my first guitar. My best buddy, who started playing guitar 4 months before I, gave me the freewheeling Bob Dylan as a 14th birthday present. And that's when I got my guitar, as a 14th birthday present from my parents. And it's an astonishing album. And I realized, here's a guy from a town smaller than mine, and yet there's a whole world in his songs. How does he do that? But when I was 20, I decided I really wanted to make a deep dive into Appalachian music. And I hitchhiked all over the region, met all kinds of people, and I was learning to play a bunch of different instruments. And when I would do a show, I would sing some of these puny little songs that I was writing next to these monsters of traditional music that had been worn smooth and beautiful in 1,000 tongues before mine. And I realized how awful my songs were. And I decided, well, I need to learn how to write songs the same way I learned to play the fiddle. And so I just found those people who came out of the tradition, had that kind of rootedness and that kind of narrative style, and tried to figure out how did they do that. In much the same way I would hear Roscoe Holcomb play the banjo, and I'd say, how in the world is he doing that? And then teach myself how to do it. I think Jean Ritchie was my first songwriting hero. I mean, she's such a good songwriter that most people don't know she's a songwriter. So I just worked at it and tried to emulate the great ones. That's how you learn how to play baseball.
Yeah.
how you learn how to write songs.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I appreciate all that background, because I think it sets up well for Leap, which, again, we talked about earlier, is your third album since the pandemic. And we'll get to the specific songs. We're going to talk about The Ride, The Troubles, Sorryland, and Work. But if you can just talk a little bit about the album itself, and you mentioned the letters were written, I think, in the fall of 2020, and just how quickly it came to be, and then when you realized you had another album on your hands.
Well, I knew right away when I put out Cabin Fever, which was the first of the three albums, and it was really the songs that I wrote in the 3 weeks that I was quarantined in my cabin in North Georgia. But I even while I was recording that, and I recorded it at home. I mean, you couldn't go into a studio.
Right.
And I also, it's the most naked album I've ever done, in that it was just me and an instrument, no overdubs, no harmonies, no bass player, nothing, because it felt like that was the nature of the album. It was a guy in quarantine.
Right.
But it took time to record it and mix it and get artwork and everything together. So I'm still writing as we're going along. And I thought, well, this is a nice problem to have, but I have to figure out what kind of story this is all telling. And I kept saying, when I got the Bucket List, which was the second of the 3 albums, it was like I had this big body of songs, and I was picking this and this and putting them together and see how the chess pieces worked. And there were songs that I would say, oh, no, I'm going to save that for another album. No, I'm going to save that for another album. And this is that other album. In some respects, I think it's some of the best songs of the bunch. And they're all over the place.
Yeah,
It's really wacky. And doing the album, like Bucket List, I didn't want it to be just me. And I have a group of my musical recording posse has sort of solidified about 5-6 years ago. It was like, so this is my sound. These are the guys all of whom are incredible studio musicians, and some go out, like Stuart Duncan, goes out on the road with anybody that can afford him. When we get together live, it's like, here are the songs. Let's figure out what we're going to do with them. And no, I'm not going to give you charts. I'm not going to give you the parts. Let's do this cooperatively. And what has developed is the fellas, and they all happen to be fellas, get really invested. They want to know the backstories of the songs, and they really, they appreciate that I'm giving them the freedom to just put their fingerprints on these things. So now here we are, all in our home studios, emailing files all over the place. It's crazy. And the real magician in all this is Bob Dawson, the engineer, who made it all sound like we were in the same room.
Yeah, I guess there's an organic feeling you get, even though, like you're saying, it does sound like you're all there, and especially the ride, the first song, and we'll just go right into it. And there's a real breeziness to it, and to me, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the album. And like you're saying, I really like to get into the background of songs, so if we can go into a little detail about this song, because it seems like it led to perhaps the title of the album in the first place.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the things I did at the beginning of the pandemic, because trying to avoid being fat and lazy, I've kept up a pretty rigorous exercise regime my whole adult life, is I bought a cheap treadmill. But I'm kind of guy who would be easily bored just riding a treadmill, so I would listen to podcasts while I was on the treadmill. And my favorite podcast was a radio show until this year called On Being. And it's hosted by this wonderful conversationalist. She's not even an interviewer, named Krista Tippett. And she was talking with someone, and I regret that I can't conjure up who this is, but they were talking about the point at which you make a decision about some action. And the point between that and the result of that action, the result is often determined not by the decision, but the abandon with which you dedicate yourself to that decision. You go all in. In this case, it was this kid. He's scared. He's jumping off into a quarry. And you just think, well, I may belly flop at the end, but that's just one instant. In the meantime, baby, I'm flying.
I've never been the sort accused of living on the edge, but at the quarry I just reared back and jumped right off the ledge. My granddad used to say, if you ain't living, then you die. Still, I cannot be certain if I'm falling or I'm flying. There's a surprise round every corner, you best learn this from the start. Knuckle down and buckle up, hold on to your heart.
It was obviously a metaphor for just going all in on life.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of it left.
Yeah.
So I'm being a lot more daring.
It feels like, I don't know how it works for you, but talking to a number of different writers, the way the songs come are very different. Some just arrive, some take weeks, if not months. And to me, it seems like this one came pretty quickly, just the way the lyrically, just the syncopation of it. I don't know, and I could be reading too far into it, but I'm always curious, like how did they come to you, the inspiration, and does it just like instant, or did it take a while to get this one right? So
Yeah, I actually tend to write pretty quickly. In these days when I was essentially writing a song a day, I would get it all together, and then when I was up at the cabin, I have a little room down below that I've set up a kind of a basic demo recording situation. And I will go down there and I'll do it, and then I will completely forget about it because I get up the next day and I write another song. When I walk my dog, I often take my phone with all these demos on it, and I'll listen to it. And that's when I will do a lot of my rewriting. I've been doing this long enough that a lot of the editing happens pretty spontaneously. What has really sort of supercharged the speed of my writing is realizing that I want to wrap a lot of this up in a story. And so what is this story? And as I said before, what's the voice? So there's obviously a certain amount of rewriting that happens, but most of it comes out pretty cleanly these days.
Before we leave this song, I do want to go back to you talk about who was the voice and what's the story, and the voice or the story. The voice is a young kid who just jumps off into the quarry, and I just wonder, when you put yourself into that mindset, does that? I know you say you write quickly, but is it once you decide that voice, is it just like that, or do you have to kind of like mind anything? Or
I usually come to the voice pretty quickly. Sometimes I will back up and say, no, that's been done before. So it's like you go into a room and you look, when I do these songwriting camps, and one of the things I'm sure they're sick of me saying is, watch the movie. Because I tend to write really cinematically. I see these things. If I could afford to make music videos, everybody would be sick of me. So it's like you go in and you know what the situation is, and you look around, you say, okay, who's talking? Who's going to tell, in this room of all these characters, who's going to tell this story? And you settle, and it's like you identify the most obvious voice. And that's what's really made a huge difference for me.
All the courage that it took to jump happened back up there. If it was a good decision, well, the water will decide. If you ain't living, then you're dying. So just enjoy the ride. There's a surprise round every corner. You best learn this from the start. Knuckle down and buckle up and hold on to your heart.
Well, the next song that talk about the troubles is third person, but I this one just jumped out at me because I'm sure you and like many millions of Americans, I claim Irish heritage, and my grandmother's family actually was from a county in the Republic, but right on the border of Northern Ireland. And I think about where we are now, and I think this is through your song, and it just seems like this is a parallel to what we're seeing. And I'm just curious from what led you to take on this topic and then really update it.
Well, in 2019, I did a series of workshops and concerts in Belfast. I'd never been there before, though my family is from Northern Ireland. So it was with really wide open eyes and a kind of hunger to find out more about this country and this people that my family was a part of, at least for a while, between their emigration from Scotland and their emigration to Canada and eventually the United States. And in the workshops, the songwriting workshops that I was doing, and this was almost 20 years after the Good Friday agreement, it was still a presence in people's lives. And most of the people who were in the workshop were in their 30s and 40s, so they had grown up during the Troubles. And so many of them were working it out through their songs, and they were really, really wonderful songs. And one of the concerts I did over there was with Tommy Sands, who's an old friend of mine, and probably one of the great unsung heroes outside of Ireland in helping resolve the Troubles. I came back to this country seeing the kind of sectarianism that reflected so much of what was happening over there and what's happening in Israel and what's happening in Iraq and Iran and what's happening in Africa and all these places that we think of these things happen over there. And I see it unfolding right here. And it's tragic and pointless.
In the times of the Troubles, tired and aggrieved, neighbors killed neighbors for what they believed. Then they knelt in their churches, prayed to the same God, never once doubting the path that they trod. The confusion and enmity on full display, revenge, retribution, the rule of the day. To the history of hatred, we all are made slaves. To kill in revenge, you'd best dig to grave.
And it's a gorgeous song, I mean, both musically and lyrically. And you kind of have there's that old Lincoln, I think it's a Lincoln quote, we talk about praying to the same God. You know, in the Civil War here, and obviously the Troubles were a Civil War. And, you know, I grew up as a youngish Gen Xer. You know, I came of age and the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed and the peace accord and apartheid ended. And it seemed like a pretty exhilarating time to be alive. And now it's like, oh boy. And this song really just struck out at me. Also, what I liked about it is that you don't really take sides and you don't point fingers. And I think that's what's so important about it.
That would have been antithetical to the whole notion of what this is. It's, you know, you're asked to take sides, place your bet. I bet you will all lose.
Before you imagine you're out on the ledge, one path or the other, they ask you to choose, casting your lot with a bet you all lose. We think of the Troubles, the far and the few, Protestant, Catholic, Palestinian, Jew, Hutu and Tutsi, Sunni and Shiite, Republican, Democrat, the left and the right.
You know, I have lived in the South for 50 years. I was raised in Wisconsin. I came down here because I fell in love with the music. And I have always had neighbors who I would disagree with on lots of stuff, but we still loved one another because we were neighbors. And we had, especially in rural areas, you had to depend upon one another. And you realized, I don't like the fact that you're a Braves fan and I'm a Yankee fan. You know, it can often come down to stuff like that. And granted, there's some much more life and death matters. But, you know, when your barn is on fire, you're not checking the fire brigade to see who voted for whom. You see, this is an emergency, all hands on deck.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're kind of in that place as a country.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time, John. We got 2 more songs, and next one up is Sorryland, which again, all too relevant and feels like an updated version of John Prine's Paradise in a sense, but very different music and very different timing in terms of what we're talking about here. But I noticed in some of the notes that Wendy sent that you wrote a lot of these sort of like in your cabin on the mountain, I presume. Is that
most of them?
Yeah, and I wonder if this was one of them, and just kind of having that landscape as your inspiration, how that may have led to this song.
Well, this is more of a landscape for me 40 and 50 years ago. When I first moved south, I was spending a lot of time in East Kentucky and West Virginia and Upper East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, all of which are coal mining territory, which is so very different. There's no coal in North Georgia. So you don't look out and see a mountain that used to be that is no longer there, and sparse vegetation and mudslides and stuff like that. So I've actually written a lot about coal and the effects of mountaintop removal, which is just sort of a gentrified way of talking about strip mining. But this puts it in a slightly different place. It talks more about the broad form deed.
Here comes a truck full of gravel again. I guess the road washed out up around the bend. I can't imagine how this will end. It won't be for them not trying. What up cheap at the old strip site. I knew it never worked, but they thought it might. Spent every dime trying to make it right, but it's like the land is dying.
Broad form deed was something that was put into place, and Kentucky got rid of it via a public referendum. And essentially what happened is at the beginning of the 20th century, when the extractive industries in the Appalachians were really getting going, and we're talking about, first it was timber and later coal. Immediately following on coal was gas and natural gas. And so representatives from those companies would come through and knock on people's doors and say, we want to buy the mineral rights to your land. My land's not for sale. No. We don't want your land. We want what's underneath the land. And for that, we will pay you, it started off at 25 cents an acre. And by the time my farm was on the market and I bought it, it was $1 an acre. And, we had enough land that paid our property taxes. Mm-hmm. And it was like, oh, well, free money. But what the broad form deed indicated was that the company who holds the rights to your minerals can retrieve those minerals in any fashion they choose, which meant building roads. The language I did was canals, waterways, and these were used a lot. People would come in, and as the song says, and it's certainly not the first songs to talk about family cemeteries being buried, creeks and wells poisoned and creeks turned brown because there's no longer any vegetation on the hillside, and when it rains, it just big mudslides are coming down. And we saw some of that happen just recently in Southeast Kentucky.
All we had, for it was over. Covered up the graves where people sleep. Greed and power don't come cheap. At night upon my knees I pray, these rains won't wash my dreams away. Right here's where I'm gonna make my stand, 'cause we ain't got more than this sorry land. When I was a kid, I fished these creeks. Deep in the woods, I played hide and seek. I hiked these hollers till my knees got weak. Was a long lifetime ago. And then the man showed up with the broad form deeds. Lies as thick as Jimson Weeks. said the nation had its needs to be satisfied by.
It was a really fun one to write, and it was a little musically perkier.
Yeah, because I've wondered about that. How obviously that's a conscious decision to have it that kind of like with the drum beat and to keep it. That's not a light song, but just gives it that like, okay, this is a catchy, peppy song, and then you listen to the lyrics like, oh, there's something more going on here. How do you make that decision?
I remember being a part of a political music workshop years ago with Holly Near. And she said something that sometimes when you're about to say something terrible, smiling while you say it makes it a little easier to digest and to hear, because otherwise you're just totally incapacitated by it. And with this, I just thought, when I wrote it, I had that sort of jumpy guitar part. And when we actually brought the drummer into the studio. He overdubbed the drums on this, believe it or not, which shows you how backwards. And I just had some stories I wanted to tell, and I think I just didn't want to wear the listener out.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap things up with Work, which I feel like I've said this every song we talked about. It's another incredibly relevant song, but speaking of just storytelling, it's brilliant. You tell you cast a wide net, but the lyrics, the gold watch that's shiny and useless, and you're telling quite a story here. And it seems like from beginning to end, and that's that movie I guess you're talking about. But that opening verse that packs a punch.
Well, my wife is binging a television show right now that I've seen. Every now she's learned that you can pack a lot of information into a seemingly innocuous phrase. You're giving a lot of information, and so I wanted to. This guy's obviously retired. Mm-hmm. Gold watch is and so many older men that I know kind of putter around their house because they don't know what to do when they're not showing up at the office, at the factory, at the clinic, wherever they work.
The gold watch sits shiny and useless in the drawer with his mother's old locket. His time as ever hangs from a chain securely tucked in his front pocket. He putters about, filling his days with lists of forgotten old chores, marking his hours with silence he never heard down on the factory floor.
And there's another song on the album about my father-in-law, my Cuban father-in-law, showing up for his first day at work, at his first job in this country after he immigrated. And so I kind of went back there, the immigrant story of, my father, your father came in here and he didn't know anything about the language or about the land. And now it's your turn to pick up the mantle, and your whole family is counting on you. But you still, you'll go down to the bar after the shift.
Yeah.
And you have this relationship with these other people that you work with. And eventually now you're all retired and you're all meeting for coffee. And you're saying, well, geez, it's like nobody misses me there because somebody came along and just picked up the job.
Relive the old days once again, stooped by the years into the shadows of once were these eager young men who took up their tools, who took up the task with work that was honest and real, building a nation in a world and a future as strong and as bright as the steel.
the conversations that happen with retired workers, because every writer I know, every good writer is a good eavesdropper.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't tell you how many times I have lingered for hours at some restaurant because there's a really interesting conversation going over here. And that's part of where this song came from, was, that this work is honest and real,
right,
to the people. And they say that someday there'll be a machine that'll make every bit of this steel.
Mm-hmm.
And well, where will the young people go for work that is honest and real?
Relay, you hand off the tongs and the hammer to the next one who's coming along. And the work, it gets done just the same as before. They scarcely will notice you're gone. They say that one day there will be a machine that'll make every bit of this steel. And you wonder, where will all the young people go to find work that is honest and real?
I'm glad you picked this song, frankly, because when I put all these songs together in this album, I thought there are going to be some songs that people they'll pass over, but I think this is an important song. So thank you for picking it.
Yeah, well, it's funny, in talking to you, that other part of it that I hadn't thought much about was just when you work these jobs and then you're retired, and what do you do at that time? I mean, I think we all know people who have struggled with that time when they're like, I used to be, every day was filled with something. I was making decisions, or I was doing this, and then all of a sudden it's gone. And no matter how you think of it, my dad, he planned his retirement the whole time he was working, and so he just was an exception, I think, to the rule. Unfortunately, he passed before he could enjoy it. But I think of so many people that I know who, when they stop working, they lose a lot of their sense of who they are.
Well, and I think some of it is that you felt like you were being useful.
Mm-hmm.
You were doing something that was productive and that helped your family, helped your community, helped the world. You're building steel, you're making steel, and they build ships and airplanes and bridges. And, I've been with old timers who will say, see that building? I built that. And you could look with pride. And now it's, hey, you have that app on your phone?
Right. Yeah.
I coded that.
Yeah. And then it gets 2 weeks later, it's irrelevant. that's the mentality.
I was version 2.1.
Yeah.
That was the good one.
Yeah. The one that I had to re-enter all my contacts again. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, John, I want to thank you so much for your time tonight. As we wrap up, you're going back on tour? Is that?
I've been out some in the spring. Pretty much everything in the winter dried up when the Omicron released its little viral head. Certainly doing less than I used to do. It was part of the advantage of this little practice for retirement. Do I really need to get on an airplane every weekend? No. I like being home. Maybe I should be writing more and touring less. I'm out there about half as much as I used to be, and that's just fine with me, and probably fine for everybody else.
Right. Well, so in terms of how people can get lead, so I see your folkmusic.com, is that where people can go get a copy of it?
Yeah, well, it's going to an artist's website is always the most advantageous to the artists themselves.
Right.
Now that there's not local CD stores like there used to be, it's more direct stuff, but all the usual places, iTunes, Amazon, what few local CD stores there are, they'll all have it. And so shop local as much as you can.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, John. Greatly appreciate your time tonight.
Sure thing, Rob.
So my thanks again to John McCutcheon for joining me and for giving us all the inspiration that we need, especially as our country faces some difficult times right now. Anyway, thanks for John for making us all feel like we have a lot to give. I want to thank you for listening, and I want you to stay tuned because I got a lot more coming. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.